Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Keith Anderson was 48 years old and had a solid career as a civil engineer in Seattle, Washington. He worked for a respected firm that designed bridges and urban infrastructure, and his reputation in the industry was flawless. Valerie, his 44-year-old wife, was a freelance graphic designer who worked from home, creating visual identities for small businesses and startups. They'd been married for 20 years, a union that had begun with passion and closeness but now seemed to be unraveling without Keith quite understanding when or how it had all started to fall apart. Their mutual decision not to have children, made early in their marriage, had never brought either of them regret. Or at least that's what Keith believed. The first signs that something was wrong appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly. Valerie began complaining about their routine, saying their life had become too predictable. Keith tried to understand, proposed changes, suggested they finally take that trip to Europe they'd always planned but never made happen. Valerie dismissed the idea with a careless wave of her hand, saying she was busy with important projects. He suggested they resume their Sunday walks through Discovery Park, a habit they'd let go. She said she didn't have the energy for it. Keith proposed romantic dinners, weekend getaways to cabins in the mountains, even adopting a dog. Each suggestion was met with indifference or polite refusal. It was on a rainy October night, while they ate dinner in silence in the kitchen of their shared home in Queen Anne, that Valerie dropped the sentence that would sear itself into Keith's mind like a branding iron. "Things have cooled between us, Keith. I don't know if I still feel what I used to." She said it while looking down at her plate, as if commenting on the weather. Keith's chest tightened, but he tried to stay calm. He asked what she meant exactly, whether there was something he could do to change things. Valerie just sighed and replied that some things couldn't be fixed, that maybe this was just the natural course of a long marriage. Keith insisted on couples therapy, but she refused, saying she didn't believe in that sort of thing. The conversation ended there, leaving Keith confused and with a hollow ache in his chest he couldn't fill. In the weeks that followed, Valerie grew even more distant. She spent hours locked in her office, citing tight deadlines. Keith respected her space and her work, but he couldn't ignore the changes. Valerie started going out more often, always with excuses about client meetings or brainstorming sessions with collaborators. She'd come home late, sometimes close to midnight, with vague explanations and a different scent in the air. Keith tried not to be paranoid, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong kept growing like a shadow in his mind. It was during this time that Valerie made a suggestion that, at the moment, seemed harmless. One Saturday afternoon, while reviewing household finances together, she proposed transferring all the utility bills into her name. "It makes more sense, Keith. I work from home and deal with this stuff all day. It'll be easier for me to manage everything." Keith saw no issue with it. He trusted Valerie completely, and besides, she'd always been organized with paperwork and payments. He signed the necessary documents without hesitation, transferring electricity, water, internet, and even the condo fees into her name. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a practical reorganization. Days turned into weeks, and Keith kept working long hours, trying to focus on his projects to avoid thinking about the chasm opening up in his marriage. Valerie, meanwhile, grew increasingly absent, physically and emotionally. She barely spoke to him, her answers were monosyllabic, and sex had become a distant memory. Keith felt like a ghost in his own home, invisible and irrelevant. The pain was constant, but he didn't know how to turn things around. Everything changed on a gray Tuesday in November. Keith was in his home office, sorting through personal documents for tax season, when he came across a folder Valerie had left on the table. Inside, mixed in with old receipts and invoices, was an electricity bill. Keith picked it up absent-mindedly, but something caught his eye. The address wasn't their Queen Anne home. It was an apartment in Bellevue, an upscale area on the other side of Lake Washington. Keith's stomach clenched. He double-checked, thinking it might be a mistake, but the name on the bill was unmistakable, Valerie Anderson. Keith's heart started racing. He opened his laptop and logged into the joint bank account they used for household expenses. There, among the usual transactions, he found a series of payments he'd never noticed before, monthly charges to that Bellevue address. Electricity, water, internet, condo fees, all paid by Valerie, all for an apartment Keith had never known existed. A wave of nausea hit him. The pieces began falling into place, painfully and clearly. The client meetings. The odd hours. The emotional distance. The unfamiliar perfume. The cooling of their marriage. Keith wasn't the type to hesitate. His nature as an engineer had taught him to assess problems and act quickly before structures collapsed. He grabbed his phone, wrote down the address, and without a second thought, left the house that same afternoon. The drive to Bellevue took only 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Keith was filled with a mix of anger, pain, and a strange, determined calm. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He needed to confirm what he already knew deep down. The building was elegant and modern, with a glass facade and security at the entrance. Keith parked across the street, where he could watch the main entrance. He waited, gripping the steering wheel, jaw clenched. It didn't take long. About 40 minutes later, a familiar car appeared, Valerie's silver Honda Accord. She pulled into the garage and got out, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a man Keith recognized immediately, Justin Mercer, a freelance photographer Valerie had said she was collaborating with on recent projects. He was around 35, clean-shaven, dressed in casual but expensive clothes. Keith watched as they walked together toward the entrance, laughing at something Justin had said, Valerie touching his arm in an intimate, familiar way. The sight felt like a knife to the chest. Keith got out of his car and followed them into the building, keeping his distance. There was no doorman at the moment, just security cameras. He saw Valerie and Justin step into the elevator and press the button for the 10th floor. Keith waited for the elevator to return, rode up, and walked down the hallway until he found the apartment number that matched the invoices he'd seen. He stood there for a few minutes, listening to muffled laughter coming from inside. Each second was torture, but it also fed a cold, calculated anger Keith hadn't known he possessed. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door, 3 firm, sharp raps. The laughter stopped instantly. There was a tense silence, then hurried footsteps. The door opened, and Valerie appeared, her face instantly turning paper white. Her eyes widened in pure terror. Keith, she whispered, her voice breaking. What are you doing here? Keith stepped inside without being invited, pushing the door open firmly but without violence. Justin stood frozen in the middle of the living room, a glass of red wine in his hand. The apartment was small but tastefully decorated, clearly a nest prepared for secret meetings. Keith slowly looked around, taking in every detail, before turning his eyes back to Valerie. He smiled, but it was a cold smile, devoid of warmth. You said things had cooled between us, Val. So I figured I'd let you handle heating this place all by yourself. Valerie began stammering, trying to find words, but Keith raised his hand, silencing her. He turned to Justin, who looked like he wanted to vanish. And you must be her creative collaborator, right? The photographer? Justin didn't respond, just lowered his eyes. Keith let out a short, bitter laugh. Funny. I suggested couples therapy. She said she didn't believe in that stuff. But apparently, she does believe in paying for a secret apartment with money that was supposed to support our marriage. Valerie tried to move closer, tears starting to stream down her face. Keith, please, let me explain. It's not what you think. Keith stepped back, avoiding her touch. Not what I think. Val, I have the bills. All of them. Electricity, water, internet, condo fees. All in your name. All for this address. You were clever putting everything in your name, weren't you? Thought I'd never find out. His voice was controlled, but each word dripped with venom. Valerie dropped to her knees, sobbing. It was a mistake. I was confused, feeling trapped. It wasn't about you, Keith. It was about me. Keith looked at her with an expression mixing contempt and sadness. No, Val. It was about you and him. And about you making me look like a fool while you funded your little affair. He pulled his phone from his pocket and showed her the screen. While I was driving here, I sent emails to your parents, my parents, and some of your key clients. Attached were copies of the bills and some very interesting screenshots I found in our shared email. The one you forgot I also have access to. Messages planning meetings here. Photos. Everything. Valerie's face twisted in desperation. You didn't do that. Keith, you've destroyed my reputation. Keith tilted his head, the bitter smile still on his lips. Did I destroy it? No, Val. You did that yourself. I just made public what you tried to hide. He looked again at Justin. And you, I found out you're married too. I'm sure your wife will love hearing where you've been spending your afternoons. Justin finally spoke, his voice trembling. Man, I didn't know she was still with you. She said you two were separated. Keith laughed, a hard, humorless laugh. Of course she did. And you believed her because it was convenient. Well, now you two can deal with the consequences together. Keith turned to leave, but Valerie grabbed his ankle, pleading. Please, Keith. We can talk. We can fix this. He gently but firmly pulled away, looking at her one last time. There's nothing to fix, Val. You said things had cooled. Well, now you've got all the freedom to live the hot, exciting life you wanted. I just hope it's worth paying for it all on your own. He walked out of the apartment, closing the door behind him, leaving Valerie's desperate sobs echoing in his wake. In the days that followed, Keith moved with surgical precision. He'd already contacted a lawyer the morning before going to the Bellevue apartment. The divorce proceedings began immediately, and Keith presented all the evidence of infidelity, the apartment bills, the emails exchanged between Valerie and Justin, even phone records and text messages he'd managed to recover. His lawyer assured him the case was solid and that Keith would have a strong advantage in the division of assets, especially since Valerie had used marital funds to sustain an extramarital relationship. The public exposure was devastating for Valerie. Her parents, conservative, religious people living in Spokane, were shocked and deeply disappointed. They cut off contact with her for weeks, unable to process their daughter's betrayal. Valerie's clients, many of them small business owners who valued ethics and trust, began canceling contracts. The news spread quickly through Seattle's creative circles, a surprisingly small and interconnected community. Within days, Valerie watched her client list shrink dramatically. Projects were canceled, proposals rejected, and her once respected name became synonymous with scandal. Justin faced a similar fate. His wife, upon learning the truth through an email Keith had sent containing irrefutable proof, kicked him out of the house immediately. Justin's divorce was swift and brutal. He lost shared custody of their 2 young children and was ordered to pay substantial child support. His reputation as a photographer also suffered, with clients questioning his character and choosing to work with other professionals. The relationship between Justin and Valerie, which had seemed so intense and passionate in their secret apartment, didn't survive the pressure of exposure. They split just a few weeks later, each dealing with the wreckage of their own lives. Keith and Valerie's divorce was finalized in record time, less than 6 months. With no children involved and undeniable proof of infidelity, the judge ruled in Keith's favor on nearly every issue. He kept the queen and house, the couple's most valuable asset, as well as the majority of their joint savings. Valerie was left with her car and a few pieces of furniture, but mostly with the debts she'd accumulated maintaining the Bellevue apartment. The bills she'd worked so hard to hide were now solely her responsibility, and she quickly realized she couldn't afford them without the stable income she'd lost. Keith, meanwhile, made a radical decision. He didn't want to stay in a house full of memories now tainted by betrayal. He put it up for sale and, within weeks, found a buyer willing to pay a generous price for the well-located property. With the proceeds from the sale and his share of the asset division, Keith bought a modern penthouse with views of Puget Sound in a new downtown Seattle building. The apartment featured floor-to-ceiling glass, minimalist finishes, and a spectacular view of the water and distant mountains. It was a complete fresh start, a space with no history, no ghosts from the past. The move was liberating. Keith began dedicating more time to himself, something he'd neglected for years. He started running again, picked up the reading habit he'd abandoned, and even began taking Italian cooking classes on Saturdays. At work, his focus returned with full force, and he led a historic bridge revitalization project that received national recognition. Colleagues remarked that Keith seemed renewed, lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Valerie, on the other hand, sank deeper and deeper. She tried to rebuild her career, but her tarnished reputation was a constant obstacle. She lost the Bellevue apartment after 3 months when she couldn't afford the rent and the sky-high bills of a place she now occupied alone. She moved into a small, poorly lit studio in Renton, a Seattle suburb where rent was more affordable. Her social circle shrank drastically. Friends who'd once been close now avoided her, unable to look at her without remembering the scandal. Even her parents, though they eventually resumed contact, never treated her the same way again. There was a distance, a coldness that hadn't been there before. Nights were the worst for Valerie. Alone in the claustrophobic studio, she replayed every choice that had led her there. She wondered exactly when it had all started falling apart, when the vague dissatisfaction she'd felt in her marriage had turned into the devastating decision to betray Keith. She tried to convince herself it had been a legitimate search for happiness, but deep down, she knew the truth. It had been pure selfishness, an impulsive attempt to fill a void she'd created herself by pushing away the man who'd always loved her. Months after the divorce, Keith found himself in a surprisingly peaceful place. He wasn't actively looking for a new relationship, but he wasn't closed off to the possibility either. One spring evening, while dining alone at a seaside restaurant, he met Diana, a landscape architect who worked at a firm partnered with his. They started talking casually, discovering shared interests and a genuine connection. There was no rush, no pressure, just the light, natural possibility of something new. Keith had learned valuable lessons from the pain he'd endured. He realized trust was essential, but that discreet vigilance wasn't paranoia, it was common sense. He learned people could change, that marriages could die even when one partner was still fighting to save them. But above all, he learned that true strength wasn't in holding onto something already broken, but in having the courage to let go and rebuild from the ruins. Valerie, alone and cut off from the life she once knew, learned her own bitter lessons. She discovered that actions have real and lasting consequences, that betrayal doesn't just destroy the person who's been betrayed, but also corrodes the soul of the one who betrays. She learned that, "Things have cooled" wasn't a valid excuse for breaking vows and trust, but rather a call for communication, honesty, and mutual effort. Lessons that came far too late, when there was nothing left to save. On the penthouse balcony overlooking Puget Sound, Keith stood watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. A gentle breeze blew in from the sea, carrying the scent of salt and freedom. He held a glass of red wine, not to forget, but to celebrate. To celebrate the truth revealed, justice served, and the life he'd rebuilt with his own hands. The apartment was warm, not from electricity paid for with lies, but from the genuine warmth of an honest, well-earned fresh start. Keith smiled to himself, a calm and sincere smile. Yes, things had cooled. But only for Valerie, who now reaped the winter she'd sown all on her own. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.